Hey, peace and love, peace and love. This is Brother Garfield, and this is number 7 in the 20 for 20. And I do want the people to recognize that we do have some upcoming folks coming up. We got Dr. Maggie Bryson, we got Brother Shakara out of the UK, we got the brother Anaim Ben Kazriel. What are you doing for the community? We got Dr. David Litwa tomorrow. Chuck Morgan is going to be put off until next Saturday. And our this Saturday coming, and of course, barbershop conversations on the anniversary of Malcolm X's passing. All right, but for now, ladies and gentlemen, I want you guys to check out one of my best interviews I have ever done, and that's with Dr. Josh Bowen, which is today. This is this one today right here. I want you guys to check it out. I think I'm getting better as an interviewer, man. But check this out. It was pre-recorded. We'll have an after show and we talk about different things. But he went into a lot. And he has a book, The Handbook for Atheists. This is the part 2. It's a pretty good book. I want y'all to check it out. All right? Peace and love.
Hey, how you doing out there in the YouTube world? I got a very special guest today, man. One of my favorite people. You know, in the hip hop game, we say, who's the top 5 dead or alive? Well, I'm telling you right now, as far as scholars in my book, who I read and who I mimic, whether directly or indirectly, because we share a lot as far as information. We share some of the same type of perspectives. And I want to say, welcome to what we call the Dagger Squad or the Brother Garfield podcast. This is Dr. Josh Bowen, legend. Let me add that to it. Let me add legend with an L to it. He never got an intro like this, family. He never got an intro like this nowhere else. Mid-vision, and everybody's going to be jealous now. I call him legend. But the reason why I'm stressing this intro to this gentleman, because he has written a book, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 1. But what he did to Garfield is sneak in a part 2 and decided to do all these interviews with 1,000 different YouTube channels and forgot to say, hey, let me give Garfield an interview. So I said, you know what? Let me call my brother up. Let me text him. Let me shoot him a text early in the morning and surprise him. Say, hey, Dr. Josh, I would love to interview you about your book, Old Testament, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 2. Since I'm not aware of it, I knew it was coming out, but I didn't know when it came out until I saw Myth Vision talking about it. And then I got a little upset. But hey, no more YouTube jealousy going on. Sorry. You, Dr. Josh. Thanks for joining me. How are you doing today?
Oh yeah, doing well, and that definitely is the most gracious and kind introduction I think anybody's ever given. So thank you. It's certainly not deserved, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, very very humble guy. I mean, he's not the smartest in his family, of course. His
no. Yes.
And you have a YouTube channel called Digital Hammurabi. Tell us a little bit about your YouTube channel and what you do.
Yeah, so both Megan and I are Assyriologists. So, we went to Johns Hopkins University to get our PhDs. Megan's, most of the way through hers. But we studied the languages and cultures of ancient Iraq. So, Mesopotamia. So we read Akkadian, Sumerian, those sorts of things. And that's mostly what we do on the channel. So we talk about the ancient Near East and, from like 3000 BCE down to like the conquest of Alexander the Great. Mm-hmm. What that has done, because I have a background in Hebrew Bible, that has brought us into the realm of Christian apologetics, particularly Old Testament Christian apologetics. And so a chunk of the channel, at least, is dedicated to answering sort of these apologetic arguments about things like slavery in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament violence, those sorts of things. So that's what we do.
Okay. I learned a lot from your channel. Your favorite series about Daniel is my favorite. And every time I need to refresh my brain, I just watch all the 5 to 6 episodes of it. It's pretty very informative. Now, what's different about Volume 2 and Volume 1? And for those who don't know, this gentleman who you see on the screen does have a book. You're going to see the logo in the top, The Atheist Handbook of the Old Testament, Volume 2. And you're also going to see me flash this a couple of times on the screen and block both of our faces out, The Atheist Handbook of the Old Testament, Volume 2 by Dr. Josh Bowen. But what's different about Volume 2? Because I thought Volume 1, when I was promoting my book, I told people get this also, and they go hand in hand. So that was an excellent write. What makes Volume 2 much better?
Yeah, so Volume 1 was, I don't want to call it an afterthought, because I think that's maybe not fair, but it's a good starting point, I think. So I had made, as you talked about, that video series on the book of Daniel. I'd also made a number of videos on slavery in the Old Testament, done a bunch of debates. So I had all of this information, all of these scripts. I'd done all this research, and it was already there. And I thought, I wrote that book, Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? And I thought, you know what, I should probably bring together a lot of this information and put it into, a resource that people can use, put it into a book. And so in that sense, it was sort of like, I didn't do the research for the book. I did the research for the videos and then used that research to bring the book together.
Okay.
Which meant that I thought, well, these are some big issues, like the prophecy against the city of Tyre in Ezekiel 26, or, did Moses write the Pentateuch? So there were some like big hot button issues, but I thought, well, if this is going to be like a handbook or an actual resource, we should have more basic introductory stuff in it.
Mm-hmm.
So then I put the front chapters in it to give that, more introductory information. But that meant that with Volume 2, I knew what I wanted to do. I knew the layout. And so it allowed me to, I think, create a thread, like a theme that can run through the entirety of the book. So the theme that runs through Volume 2 is, how do we have, as agnostics or atheists or skeptics, how do we have better conversations, more productive conversations about these things in Christian apologetics with people that defend some of these things that we wish they just would not defend, like divine commands of violence in the Old Testament. But how do we do that in a way that's actually meaningful? It's not just, people banging their heads together. And so that thread that sort of runs throughout the entirety of the book. So I think it allowed me to have a lot more intentionality in writing it.
Oh, okay. All right. So chapter 1 is about the conquest, from the conquest of Joshua to the divided monarchy. What did you cover in this? I mean, it's self-explanatory as far as chronology is concerned, of course. You're talking about after the Exodus, when it's alleged that Joshua went into Canaan and actually either killed everybody off, as far as Deuteronomy, the evil writer of Deuteronomy is concerned,
right?
Or did he go in and mingle and kind of rule over people and allow them to live?
Yeah. So one of the introductory chapters that I thought was really important to have in each of these volumes was just a chapter about the story itself. So there are two things that I see online all the time. One, and I know that you know this, you see it probably more than I do, honestly, is that when people start to read the Old Testament in particular, they start Genesis 1 and it's kind of exciting, right? They read creation. Of course, it's a little repetitive, but then they get to chapter 2 and that's cool, Adam and Eve, and then Cain and Abel. I mean, it's like, but then it gets to like genealogies. Then you get the exciting flood, but then it gets to more genealogies. And then once you get out of Genesis, it's like, now we're talking about the tabernacle. We're talking about all these various laws that seem a little weird, and people just get lost when the narrative is chopped up the way that it is. And what that does, I think, specifically for the atheist community, is it leaves us open to not knowing the story. And the story is so important because the people that we're often arguing with are like fundamentalist evangelical Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't just know the story, right? That story is history for them, right? It is what happened in the past. And so if you, come to somebody and say, how can you, worship a God, for example, or believe in a God that commands, the genocide of the Amalekite people in 1 Samuel 15. And they respond with, well, do you even know the story? Who were the Amalekites? Well, I mean, that doesn't matter, right? In a very real sense, whether you know that story or not, doesn't really matter. But in that discussion, if we're going to have better conversations, it's so much more effective for the skeptic to be able to say, well, yeah, I mean, if you go back to Exodus 17, you see how they, ambush the nation of Israel as they're coming out. And so that's why, God is like supernaturally or cosmically at war with the Amalekites, and this comes to fruition under Psalm 1 Samuel 15. Well, if you don't know that story, the apologist can just sort of like write you off, right? Like you don't even know, you don't even know the story, right? Why do I need to talk to you?
Right.
So what I did is I cut out all the stuff that is very, very important, in certain contexts, obviously. But if you're just trying to get the story, I cut all this other stuff out and I just tell the narrative itself. Like this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And so in volume 1, I went from Genesis 1:1 with creation. I went all the way to the death of Moses, just outside of Canaan. And then in volume 2, I pick it up with Joshua in charge, and I take it through into the conquest, and then through the period of the judges, and then of course the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon, until Solomon dies, and then Rehoboam and Jeroboam have their the split takes place.
Right, split. Mm-hmm.
And volume 3 will pick it up there.
Oh my God! Not a volume 3 now.
Yeah. Hopefully that will be the end. That's my plan. Then end is volume 3. But
you just jinx yourself, right?
Yeah, right.
Hopefully be the end. No, it won't be. That's like Friday the 13th.
Right.
Be the end. Went up to like volume to part 10.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
All right. So what about chapter 2, a brief history of Egypt? And of course, we have one of the brothers that I respect so much in the conscious community, Brother Reggie. And I don't know if he wants to ask a question. He'll put it in the side chat. But we're going to talk a little bit about Egypt and the Exodus. But what is it about Egypt, the brief history of Egypt, we need to know before we even read the book that you're going to tell us? Because we hear so many different stories about Egypt. What is it about Egypt that you're trying to explain?
Yeah. So, and I say this actually in the chapter pretty emphatically. Like I'm not an Egyptologist. So like everybody needs to bear that in mind. And in fact, so many of the things that I write on, I don't have it, like I didn't write my dissertation on these topics, right?
Right.
So there are people in the field, many people in the field that do this far better than I do, right? And of course, when it comes to the history of Egypt, there are so many amazing scholars that have written on this. So my goal is not to produce a history that encompasses, all of the religious or administrative or, all of these things. Essentially, what I'm trying to do with the goal of the book and keeping in line with the goal of the book is to be able to give the skeptic or the atheist a broad background to the history that surrounds the events that are either described in the Hebrew Bible or actually, took place.
Right.
So in volume 1, I did a very broad view of the history of the ancient Near East, and I did it sort of from a Mesopotamian perspective because that's where we have the majority of the data.
Right.
And so it starts around 3000 BCE and just kind of goes, right? And it touches on Egypt a little bit, touches obviously on Syro-Palestine, touches on the Hittites, those sorts of things. But in reality, it's just trying to give a broad background. So, for example, in the 14th century with the Amarna period, that's such a critical thing to understand, this international diplomacy that's taking place in the late Bronze Age. Because that's the time that the Exodus, for example, is purported to have happened, right? Around that time, either early traditional date or later. But so knowing that background, what's going on in Egypt, what's going on, in Mesopotamia, what's going on in Canaan, are all really, really important things to know. And so in volume 2, what I wanted to do was give it a more Egyptocentric focus. And again, it's not intended to be thorough in any way, because there's, I mean, you know this better than anybody, but there's so much there.
Yeah,
and I didn't even, what I wanted to do was try to touch on the things that if somebody's studying the Old Testament, if somebody's studying the Hebrew Bible, what might they run into in Egypt?
Right.
So, I start right at around 2000 BCE. I don't go into the Old Kingdom at all. Again, not because that's not important. It's definitely important. But the second millennium is when things start to kick off that, you often see connected to the Hebrew Bible. And so I'd say it's a very general, basic introductory overview of the history of Egypt from 2000 to about, again, the conquest of Alexander the Great. But I think it gives that background so that when you see something, like Nebuchadnezzar comes and has the battle at Carchemish in 605, the players that are there, like who is Necho II, right? These are things that if you understand what's going on in the first millennium in Egypt, that those sorts of things, start to fill in the gaps, I think.
All right. So with Egypt, of course, it's from the Middle Kingdom, and you give like a basic chronology up until Alexander, which is cool. I think that was pretty cool when you did that. Now, this chapter that comes up after this is the chapter that everybody gets sensitive about, because we've heard, from the Albright perspective, said the conquest, he said it happened. Then you heard from the Finkelstein perspective, or from the T.L. Thompson, John Van Cedars, these things didn't happen the way they didn't happen, so forth. So which direction did you go? Because you said you had the readers thinking, hey, fact or fiction. And
right.
From my perspective, I'm like fiction.
Right.
So what's going on here?
Yeah. So I think each volume, chapter 3 of each volume, is archaeology heavy. So in volume 1, I give an introduction in chapter 3 to archaeology, like how does it work? And then I give some test cases for how archaeology can help us. I look at like child sacrifice, and I look at the Philistines. So then in volume 2, and sort of keeping with that idea of let's focus on archaeology, I thought it was really important to look at the archaeology of the period that the conquest is purported to have happened. Because, as we'll talk about here in a few minutes, the evidence for the Exodus, as you know very, very well, is something that, there's a lot of, argument from silence, right, that gets thrown around.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that you run into some real problems, like some hard line problems that are very difficult to skirt around when you get to the conquest.
Yeah.
Whether you do the traditional date or whether you do the more, consensus date of the 13th or 12th centuries, the conquest just doesn't fit the archaeology. But the story doesn't fit the archaeology. And so what I wanted to do was look at utilizing Eric Klein, who is a great archaeologist, historian, who wrote a book on this. He had a methodology that he used to look at, I think I looked at 7 different cities that are mentioned in the conquest narrative. 3 from outside of Canaan proper, so 1 in the Negev, and then 2 in Transjordan, and then 4 in Cisjordan. And they're said to have been destroyed, right? And whether we take this as,
literal,
whether we take this as, somewhat hyperbolic language that everybody was killed, or whether we take this as just, totally occupied, whatever, both should be expected to show up in the archaeological record, right? And so what do we see? And the 2 questions that I ask in the chapter are, with each city, is there a city there? Like, is there a populated city there? Is there occupation at the site?
Mm-hmm.
And then is there any sign of destruction? And in all but 1 case, and I look at Arad in the Negev, I look at Heshbon and Dibon in Transjordan, and then I look at the very popular, famous sites of Jericho and Ai, and then Lachish and Hatzor. Of all of those, Hatzor is really the only one that could fit, right? And I'm like, if all of them fit like Hatzor fit, I'd say, hey, you got a good case, right?
Right.
But it doesn't, right? And
is it what the case of these cities, they're not occupied at the time when the Exodus is supposedly happened? I mean, after 1200 BC, we see some occupation and so forth.
Yeah.
Quick question: why? Because the chapter after this is chapter 4, the Exodus. Why did you put the Exodus after this? Although you're pretty much destroying the Exodus with the conquest. So why did you do that?
It was the one thing that felt weird in the book. There's like a good catch, like no question. But it's because the archaeology chapter is chapter 3, and that's how it works. So I like,
because I'm thinking, right, that this book was peer reviewed and everything. Did they say that to you also?
No, nobody mentioned it. Yeah, but I mean, it's a really good observation, right? Because the flow seems weird. You would expect to see the Exodus first from a chronological standpoint, particularly right after the chapter on Egyptian history. But it's because I deal with archaeology so much more in that chapter. It's like the archaeology chapter. That's why it's there.
Okay. All right. So we've read about the Exodus for the last 40 years from different perspectives. You've interviewed one of the best looking and smartest Egyptologists, Maggie Bryson. Yeah. And please don't tell her I said that.
Don't worry. It's this. We'll mute everybody. Yeah. It's all right.
So what are you bringing to the table that's different about the Exodus that no one? I mean, I don't know if you're trying to be totally different, but what angle are you coming from?
Yeah. So nothing. I actually try very hard to not break new ground in this series, and the reason that I try not to do that is because I want these books to focus so much on what is it that the consensus of scholars say. So, for example, in Volume 1, when I talked about did Moses write the Pentateuch, I didn't say, all right, let's argue for the documentary hypothesis, right? Or let's argue for the tradition history, or the supplementary or whatever. It's okay. Everybody debates about that stuff, but what do they all agree on? They all agree it wasn't written by one guy named Moses, right? That's what they all agree on. And the same thing is true with the Exodus chapter. So what I wanted to do was say, okay, look, what are the data points? And I sent this off actually to Mark Lucher. He's up at Temple, and such a nice guy. He was on that Exodus panel that we were over on Heathen Queen's channel, and we did an Exodus panel with Kara Cooney, Egyptologist, and Mark Lucher, who wrote on the Exodus, I think, in his 2017 book. But I sent it off to him, and I think Eric Klein read that chapter pretty thoroughly as well. And essentially, it's like, look, this is what we know, right? This is what we know, and that's what you was, and so you did it. This is the state of the field. And so what I wanted to do is say, okay, look, what are the earliest references that we have, textual references that we have to anything like the Exodus, right? So we look at stuff like Exodus 15 with the Song of the Sea, or the Oracles of Balaam in Numbers 23 and 24. The 8th century prophets, Hosea and Amos. These are like early witnesses to Exodus-like events. And we say, okay, what is it that they say? And Stephen Russell wrote a monograph on this early 2000s, I think. And he's just looking at these different traditions and saying, like, how do they differ? And what can we say about like a northern tradition, southern tradition, Transjordanian tradition? Are they the same? Are they different? But it's basically just to say what are the data points that scholars are working with. And then we just kind of talk about the main points that we see from the Egyptian perspective. So we talk about things like the papyri that the New Kingdom papyri that talk about sorry, that talk about runaway slaves, two runaway slaves that go across the border and they're tracked, or these herders from the Northeast coming down and watering their flocks in Egypt, being checked at the border and tracked. And all of those things sort of feed into we look at Pitom and Ramses, and what are these sites and what do scholars say about them? So it's broad range, I think, covering the main data points that scholars talk about. And then once we do that, it's like, okay, what are the main theories that scholars hold to? And of course, I know all about this volume, but there's this 2015 publication called Exodus, I think, from a transdisciplinary approach or something like that.
Right. With like 40 different scholars.
Yeah.
Had this whole conference, right? I have the book.
Yeah. And it's, it's an excellent volume. And like Lawrence Garrity, for example, has an article in there, and he just kind of goes through what are the main theories, right? And so it's kind of following his methodology and citing him a bunch. Just kind of walked through and said, okay, here's the traditional date. This is what they say. These are the problems with it. And one of the big problems that I see with either the traditional date or even the 13th century date that hold to a basic historicity, a historical reliability of the narrative itself, are like something like the figure of 600,000 from Exodus 12:37.
Right.
And so I talk about that in the chapter and try to just go through and say, look, why is it that everybody has understood 600 alafim? This word Aleph, this Hebrew word Aleph. Why have they understood this as 1,000? Why have they said it's 600,000 for all this time? And why is it that people are just now arguing, well, maybe it doesn't mean that. Maybe it means like a military unit. And the reason is not that we came to the linguistics and said, oh, you know what, actually in this context, it probably doesn't mean that because, this. It was, archaeology and anthropology and history in general have told us there couldn't have been 2.5 million people that left the Nile Delta, right? So that doesn't work. There's only like 3 million people estimated in all of New Kingdom Egypt. So can everybody leave? No,
exactly.
Right.
Without anybody noticing.
Right. Yes, exactly. And so I talk about things like that in the chapter. And then at the end, and one of the things that oddly I'm most proud of, it sounds weird, was the introduction and the conclusion to that chapter. Because one of the things that I think people miss, both on the atheist, skeptic, and the Christian apologetic side, is that there's more to this than just did it happen or didn't it happen, right? Faith communities utilize this story, and that's okay, right? So like the story that I told was my dad. My dad is like a 6'4", back when he was still swinging a hammer. He was like 285. Like he's just a big guy. And when things would like go his way out on the job site, you'd hear him start to sing, "Oh, my Lord knows the way through the wilderness. All I got to do is follow." And that's really all he knew of the song. He didn't know the background to it, right? It was just the story that he knew stood behind it, and this story of freedom, and this story of deliverance and liberation. And ultimately that even though things can go wrong, even though life can be bad and disrupted, that from his faith position and the faith position of his community, if he just trusted in the God that he believed in, that God would lead him through, right? And this is the story. And so I think that from a faith standpoint, even though again, consensus scholarship is that like the basic historicity of the biblical narrative is not reliable, right? That if there is historical kernels behind it, it's telescoping or talking about cultural memory or maybe a little bit of both. But the reality is that that's not the only issue that matters. And the other thing is, and then I'll shut up, but William Propp has this amazing example that I cited, where he talks about the Battle of Mons and I won't go into the details now, but like, you know, it's this story that I talk about in the conclusion to the chapter about how it was believed that the enemy had been defeated by these angelic beings, and thousands of people were purported to have seen them, right? And it made like worldwide news. I mean, it was a big thing. Like people saying, yes, you know, that this happened and we have evidence and all this stuff.
Right.
But of course, like nobody looking back at that would say, yeah, that actually were actually angelic beings that delivered the army, right?
Right.
But it's important to recognize, because William Prott brings it up to say, look, that there are reasons that stories like this develop, and they don't have to have like tons and tons of time to develop, and they can be very, very meaningful and be very believed and relied upon in the tradition, and be very meaningful in that sense. So like in a very real sense, did it matter if there were actually angelic beings? I mean, from like a historical standpoint, sure, but the army rallied, right, because of it. And there were people that were, you know, encouraged to fight and to fight hard. And so like in that sense, it didn't matter if it actually happened. So I think it's just a question of perspective. And
I got a question at the side chat from Brother Reggie. Is there one Exodus or many Exoduses made into one story at some point?
Yeah.
I think that's the most common question I hear
Yeah.
when it comes to this conversation. Go ahead, Mother.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would defer to people like Ann Killebrew, Ron Hendel, you know, Israel Finkelstein, obviously William Deaver, you know, people that Maggie Bryson, you know, people that deal with this. But I think that I don't think there's any consensus position on that, right? Is there like is there like a group of 5 people that during the late Bronze Age collapse came out of Egypt that were slaves down there, that came up and sort of went up into the highlands and joined with the fledgling, you know, nation of Israel, or, you know, proto-Israel, whatever we're going to call it, and that their story became like the national story.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, I mean, I can see that. I can also see like a telescoping of a bunch of events coming down through the second millennium, and that this is something that Ann Killebrew argues. I can also see, you know, something where, like, you know, of course, during the late Bronze Age, during the Amarna period, I mean, Egypt has Canaan under its thumb. And so, you know, like you had officials that were living in Canaan, and when everything collapsed, and people are leaving the cities or settling down, but up in the highlands, it may have felt like, oh, we're out from under bondage, right? And so, like, I could see that sort of developing into we're leaving Egypt, like leaving Egyptian control, and going up and finding our freedom up here in the highlands. I can also see it being all 3, right? I don't think that we necessarily, and it's not my area of expertise, but I don't know that we need to actually come down on one of them, but I don't think there's any consensus on that.
All right, so we're at chapter 5, the Old Testament, the violence and genocide. This is like your favorite chapter, right?
Yeah, well, I mean,
no, it's not. Number 6 is, but we get to that.
Yeah, this was a tough one. It's one that everybody's been calling for from the beginning, because it's the 1 Samuel 15 chapter, right? It's dealing with these very clear commands from the deity in the Old Testament to commit violence against people groups. And of course, the 2 main apologetic arguments that are used to address this, and you see it in people like Paul Copan, or of course people like Frank Turek, are, one, it's all hyperbole, right? It's like saying, you know, well, we really killed the Raiders in the football game.
Right,
we slaughtered them. Like, you know, so it's like that. Or, boy, they were just really, really wicked and they deserved it. And so I deal with each in turn in the chapter. And like, without boring people with the details, essentially the argument that I'm making here is that is there ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric? Is there hyperbole? Yeah, of course, absolutely, right? Mario Liverani, Lawson Younger, like they've written about this stuff for a long time. But does that get you out of the problem? And the answer is no. And so, like Sennacherib, the examples that people like Paul Copan use, because Lawson Younger used them, are actually, that's a double-edged sword for them, right? Because Lawson Younger, I think, is more using it to say we can't just do away with the historical value completely of the book of Joshua because of this, because of Joshua 10 through 12, we see this rhetoric and we think it's consistent and whatever. But to then try to use that to argue for hyperbole everywhere creates another problem for you, because now you have to say, well, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. So if I'm good with hyperbole over here, and that justifies this in the Hebrew Bible, well, then when Sennacherib does it, or when Hattusili III does it, whatever, I'm okay with that too, right? Right. Nobody's getting behind Tiglath-Pileser III. Like, nobody's doing that. So I think that creates a real problem, right? If this is ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric, if you're going to be good with it in the Old Testament, and you're not going to be good with it when Tiglath-Pileser or Tukulti-Ninurta do it, well, then it's special pleading, I think. So then the other issue that's really important is along the same lines, is that if you're going to say that the Hebrew Bible is calling for this genocide or destruction because the people are actually historically, in reality, so wicked, and this isn't like a narrative, like a literary tool to try to advance the narrative, then you've got to say that, well, why do we say that they are wicked? Well, because the text says so, and we don't have independent verification of this stuff, right? Right.
Outside sources, right?
Yeah, I talk about this in Volume 1. Like, what do we know about child sacrifice? Well, Francesca Stavrakopoulou, Heath Durrell have written on this, amongst other people, and the data just isn't there for when they would need it. But the bigger issue here, again, is that if you read through the narrative of the Hebrew Bible and say, well, look, it says that they were really, really wicked, and so that means they were really, really wicked. Well, why is it that when you read through the Tukulti-Ninurta epic in the Middle Assyrian period, and it talks about how Kashtilyashu IV of Babylonia is actually really, really wicked, and he's rebellious, and he actually says in the narrative, I have sinned, right? I'm such a bad guy. Like, why do we not get behind Tukulti-Ninurta and say, go, great job,
Only if God does it. Only if God does it.
Yeah, well, Asher's the one commanding it, right? So, I mean, if Asher's commanding it, we should be behind it. And of course, the apologist is going to say, well, Asher's not real, right? So, but then it becomes special pleading, because now you're not arguing based on historical or archaeological data. You're now arguing on the narrative itself. And now the narrative, you have to move to the narrative and have it stand or fall on other methods. And of course, and that becomes a very real problem. So,
all right, I have we got to go back to a question by Reggie. He wants to ask about the Exodus from the previous chapter.
Okay.
At some point, there need to be slaves. For the Exodus, there need to be slaves. Apologists have no proof that the indigenous Egyptians enslaved large numbers of Asiatics. What do you think about that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we do have pretty good evidence for Canaan being a source, and again, not my area of expertise. Like, I would want to defer everybody to, people like Maggie Bryson, right, to talk about this sort of thing, or Betsy Bryan, or again, Ron Hendel would have talked about this, or Eric Klein. But I do think we have good evidence for Canaan being a source of captives, right, that are taken down to serve. And I think the two slaves that are in the, and I'm blanking on the name of the papyrus, Anastasia, papyrus Anastasia. I think it's 5 or 4. I can never remember which one. Where it talks about the two slaves that leave. I think it's argued that those are, people from the area around Canaan, right? These are Semitic peoples. And so, yeah, like I do think that we've got pretty good evidence throughout the second millennium of people being taken down into Egypt to serve. But again, like as you pointed out, like is it, and I think Reggie even put it, like, is this one event? No, right? There's lots and lots of separate, times of this type of conquest of Canaan by the Egyptians, and bringing people back and those sorts of things. So,
cool. Let's get to your favorite chapter, the laws on adultery and rape.
Yeah.
How dare they have special laws for adultery and rape? And what do you do? Because I noticed you look in other ancient Near East cultures on a whole, because of course you're using a methodology. So you got to look at everybody. You're not trying to bash on the Bible for what they do. It's not the issue that the Bible do it. Everybody's basically doing the same.
That's right.
Can you break that down for me?
Yeah. So and I think this is actually a really important thing to start off with. My goal in this chapter is, or in none of these chapters is my goal to bash on an ancient text. I'm really not trying to say anything about ancient morality at all. What I am saying, or if I'm saying anything about ancient morality, it's don't use an ancient text to build your value system. That's what I'm saying. Like, don't slavishly apply. It's to give an example. It's certainly wonderful, right, for people to read through the Epic of Gilgamesh and to come away saying, you know what, we really need to value the time that we have here on Earth. We need to value, because it's limited, right? We're mortal, and this is one of the main messages of the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? How do we really make the most of the time that we have? But that doesn't mean that I slavishly apply all the lessons that I might learn from reading the Epic of Gilgamesh. Like, I don't go out to the cedar forest and kill the guardian. Like, I shouldn't try to defend that and do an apologetic for why Gilgamesh and Enkidu should have slain the bull of heaven. Like, I that's not the point. So if we're going to utilize our own moral progression, and I'm not an ethicist at all, but if we're going to use our own moral progression and look back to ancient texts to support that and to get gleanings from that, great. I think that's great. What I see happening, though, is that people will go back to ancient texts, particularly like the Old Testament, and say, look, it says homosexuality is bad here. Right. Therefore, that's what my that's what my value system says. Mm-hmm. And what happens, of course, as we all know, like, this was the sort of thing that happened for ages and ages when people looked at the biblical texts concerning things like slavery, right? Like the text is clear about slavery, at least in the legal sections. Mm-hmm. And so, like, it's really important for us to be, I think, very careful about how we come to these texts and to say, look, we're not going to build our values slavishly based upon what the text says. So with all of that in the background, what I hear people trying to do a lot is say things like, man, the Old Testament really valued women, right? Like, that it was progressive for its time, because then it lends it some sort of like divine authority, right?
Right.
The problem that I see with that is, like, how are you going to test that? Well, Daisy Yulin Tsai has a book on, like, how Deuteronomy is more progressive, and, like, we could have a discussion about that. But, like, there certainly are aspects, just like there are aspects of any ancient text that seem more progressive, right? If we were to look at the laws on debt slavery, the laws of Hammurabi only. Right. Yeah, I think it's, well, that you only keep a debt slave for 3 years, then they're released in the 4th. Well, in the Hebrew Bible, both in Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15. They're kept for 6 years.
6 years and release
Yeah.
on 7.
So would an apologist say, like, oh man, there's like, moral decay? No, of course not, right? They're just going to gloss over that.
Mhm.
So like making these types of comparisons to try to say, well, this one's much better, I think that's really problematic. So what I wanted to do to sort of demonstrate that was to look at the laws in the law collections from the ancient Near East and from the Hebrew Bible, and say, okay, what do the texts say about the crime of adultery? What is it? How do they determine that it's happened, and what is the punishment for it? And the same is true with rape. Like, how are they defining rape? How do they determine if it happened? And then what is the what's the consequence for it? What's the penalty for it? And we deal with that very, I don't want to call it famous, but like it certainly is, but like the very contentious passage of Deuteronomy 22, 28 to 29, where it says, if a man seizes a woman and lies with her and they are found, but it's talking about a virgin, an unbetrothed virgin, that the penalty is not death, as it is for, like a betrothed or already married woman.
Right.
He has to pay a fine to the father, and and then he marries her and can't ever divorce her, and that's really problematic if you want to lift that and bring it into 21st century, like America, for example, which I know a lot of people probably here want to do with their nationalism, Christian nationalism, ew, right? Yuck. Like, let's not do that because that's horrible. But I think that apologists then want to say, well, that's not really what it says. What they want to say is, well, the Hebrew word that's used here, like that's translated to seize, it really means to like embrace. So what it's saying is that it's like the man is embracing the woman. So it's actually consensual, and that's why the penalty is not death, because it's consensual sex, right? It's what they both wanted.
Man.
Yeah, no, that's nice try, as John Collins would say. Nice try. So we talk about that passage, and basically, what happens when you get to the end is that, hey, they're all sort of on par with one another, right? There's some things that are a little different here, and this collection is a little different over here, but on the whole, to commit adultery, what adultery means, and then how they determine if it happened, and what the penalties are, and the same with rape. Like, they're all pretty consistent across the ancient Near East, including the Hebrew Bible. So, like, I think this argument is problematic, that the Old Testament is like really progressive morally.
Right. All right. My favorite chapter now is chapter 7.
Yeah.
And
it's Megan's favorite too.
Yeah, because she actually did a video on it years ago. And did the Old Testament plagiarize? Were they copying? Were they looking at old cuneiform texts and said, let's get this? Old Egyptian texts on the walls and taking stuff. What were they doing?
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
It's incredibly complex, as you know. This discussion has to be nuanced in every conceivable way. So the first thing that we do, though, is, and that's why I think I entitled it, Did It Plagiarize? Because when you get to the end, if I were to just give you the conclusion, you would say, well, yeah, it did plagiarize then, right? But it didn't, and this is one of the things that I think as atheists and skeptics we need to be nuanced about, because the word plagiarize carries moral connotations with it. Like, plagiarize is like, there's this idea that there's moral mental property or intellectual property, and so somebody writes a story and that's owned by them, right? They have rights to it. And so then if somebody copies it, that's a bad thing that they're doing that. And that's what plagiarism sort of entails in the sense that we use it today. So I think it's a bad word to use when we talk about ancient texts, because they're not plagiarizing. And so I give some examples of how that's different. And one of the ones that I talk about a lot is like prayers. If anybody's ever given like a public invocation somewhere, and of course I was a pastor for 7 years, Like you get asked to pray a lot publicly.
Right.
If it's a big enough event, I'll probably script it.
Right.
And what ends up happening, if you were to like somehow go back and find all of the documents, you know, impossible, but like if you could and look at all of my prayers, they'd all obviously be different, but they would have sections that are the same.
Mhm.
So, you know, gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you've given us to come together for this event. Like I've
Right.
probably said that, you know, 50,000 times, right?
Right. Right.
Or if it was at a meal, nourish this food to the, or bless this food to the nourishment of our bodies. May we serve you with the strength we gain from it. Like nobody's saying that in, you know, like a leisurely conversation. That's very specific to that type of prayer context. But it's not original to me. I didn't come up with that. Who did? I don't know. But the thing is, nobody's upset about that. Right. In the same way that nobody's upset about, you know, this year when we start listening to Christmas music, and I'm sure that some people out there are already listening to it, which, you know, I'm behind. Mm-hmm. You'll hear relatively few completely new songs. There's a reason that we, you know, keep hearing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Frosty the Snowman and, you know, what is it, chestnuts roasting on an open fire.
Right.
And when you do hear a new song, it's a new version of one of these traditional songs. And the reason that we do that, nobody would say plagiarism, right? We like that. We like keeping to these traditions in certain contexts. And so I think that's a really good analogy to think about when you go into this discussion, to think about what is it that ancient writers are doing with other ancient texts, because they're reworking them and like doing version 2.0 sometimes, because the tradition is really, really important. And so I think that's something to bear in mind. I don't want to keep going because you might want to go a particular direction with it because there's a lot in that chapter. But right. I mean, I can talk about whatever you want, but that's sort of the background to it.
All right. Overall, though, you would say that it's like Mariah Carey's Christmas album. Everybody's buying this album. It sells so much copies because they like the version of the same song they've heard for 50 years, but yes, they like the version that Mariah Carey sings it in.
That's right. Yeah. And I would say the important thing to recognize here is the dependence. Mm-hmm. Right. That when you have somebody that sings a new version of a Christmas song, nobody goes up to them and says like, man, how'd you come up with those lyrics? Right. Because obviously everybody recognizes where that song comes from. And actually the example that I like to give is Eminem's song, Remind Me. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I give that all the time when I talk about this chapter. But if you were to, and I did this, actually, Dr. Kip Davis and I did this as sort of an exercise. If you were to take the lyrics to Remind Me and take the lyrics to I Love Rock and Roll by Joan Jett and put them next to each other, mm-hmm, without the music, you'd be very hard pressed to see a connection between them. Very hard pressed. But the moment you play the music, right? The moment you play the song, yeah, it's undeniable, right? I mean, to the point that he's got her vocals in the song, right? And once you hear the music, you make that connection, and then you start to see all the little subtle connections that he's making. Mm-hmm. And does that mean that Eminem is plagiarizing? No, of course not, right? He's doing what all good artists do, is he's utilizing stuff that's in popular culture and reworking it and saying something new. Mm-hmm. And that's what these ancient Near Eastern writers are so often doing. And excuse me, they do it in such ingenious ways today, and they did it in really ingenious ways in the past. So the example that I give in the book from the ancient Near East is looking at, there are two myths that we see that people are familiar usually with one of them if they study the Old Testament, but maybe not the other one. The Enuma Elish is the one that most people are familiar with, and that's the creation, the creation myth. But it's really about the ascendancy of Marduk, the supremacy of Marduk. The other is the earlier one, which is the Anzu myth, and the Anzu myth is a story about this, mythical bird who's incredibly powerful, and he steals this tablet that's called the Tablet of Destinies.
Okay.
And he steals it from the god Enlil, and he flies off into the mountains. And the Tablet of Destinies is this sort of thing that it kind of controls reality. It's like, one of the realities. It's like the reality stone, I guess, of the Avengers movies or whatever. And so whoever has it can control a lot about reality, and it throws the divine world just into chaos. And so a god is sought after to go fight the Anzu bird to get it back. And so they approach one god, and the god says, who can fight against Anzu? He's got the Tablet of Destinies. I can't do that. Then they go to another god. Who can fight? I can't do that. They go to the god Ninorta. And Ninorta is like convinced to go. So he goes and he fights, and there's this like vicious battle, and he can't best Anzu. And he finally pulls out his bow and arrow, and he shoots an arrow at Anzu. And Anzu, holding the Tablet of Destiny, says, "Arrow, go back to your thicket." And he turns the arrow back, speaks, using this tablet, he controls the elements and has it go back. So Ninorta can't win. Hard as he might fight, right? He can't win.
Can't win.
And so in the story, what he does is he talks to the god Enki, Ea, and Ea gives him a trick to use. So he outsmarts the Anzu bird. And the way that he does it is when he shoots, but before he shoots the arrow, he cuts some of the pinions, some of the large feathers off of the Anzu bird. And Anzu says, "Feathers, return to me," because he wants his pinions back, right? He wants his feathers back. Come back to me. When he does, that's when Ninorta shoots the arrow, because there are feathers in the fletching of the arrow. It also brings the arrow with him, right? So he outsmarts him. He's not powerful enough to beat him, but he outsmarts him. Okay, there's a reason that I told that story, because when you get to the later text, the Enuma Elish, Marduk is like, they've called him Ninorta 2.0. Because what the writer is doing is saying, hey, everybody knows the Ninorta story, the Anzu myth. Everybody knows it. And Ninorta's the hero. Ninorta's mighty. Ninorta's the warrior. He's powerful. Like, he's amazing. Everybody wants to be Ninorta from a fighting standpoint, right? Because he's so powerful. But Ninorta couldn't win, right? That's how tough Anzu was. Well, Marduk in the story, you have the goddess Tiamat, and she declares like war on all the gods, and she creates this I'm blanking on the word here, but like her consort, and his name is Kingu, and she gives Kingu the Tablet of Destinies. And so everybody knows what the Tablet of Destinies is. Everybody knows this motif, right? Everybody understands it. And whoever's holding the Tablet of Destinies is like crazy powerful. Well, in the story, again, they approach a god, but this time it's not just any god. Like, they're approaching big gods, powerful gods, important gods, and saying, "Hey, go fight Tiamat." And they're like, "Whoa, not me. Couldn't be me."
Punking out.
But Marduk, who's the protagonist of the story, the hero, he isn't asked. He volunteers. Right, Ninorta had to sort of be convinced, or to, at least asked to go. Right. Marduk is like, "Let me go." And when he goes, Kingu, the guy that's holding the Tablet of Destinies, there's no battle. There's no fight. He is defeated just by Marduk approaching. That's how powerful Marduk is. right? So it's, and there are direct connections, like linguistic connections, syntactical, grammatical connections between these two stories. So it's not just like the story itself that connects it. It's like in the same way that Eminem, I know I keep going to him, but like you could actually connect it. There goes the dime into the jukebox, right? Like that's a direct connection in the phraseology. And so, but the point is that the writer of the Enuma Elish is drawing and dependent upon the story of the Anzu myth, but he's reworking it to say Marduk's even better. He's even more powerful. So that's the sort of utilization of text that we need to be looking for when we come to the Hebrew Bible.
Wow, that's amazing. But that's a good way to look at it, for those who are into that type of mythology and all that stuff. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna wrap up the interview and tell you thank you for coming by, man. And
thank you for having me.
Out of your busy schedule. I know everybody wants a piece of Josh Bowen.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. It's very nice.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, remember, I'm gonna at the end of the broadcast. I mean, before I go, of course, I'm gonna purchase Dr. Bowen's book live and show people where to get it on Amazon so that you can all purchase and support. This is a wonderful piece of work.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for here. All right. Peace and love.
All right. So we're going to go to the after show. And as a matter of fact, before I go, let me just show you guys how you could purchase Dr. Josh Bowen's book. Let me go to Dr. Josh Bowen. All right, let's go to books. And let's go to where is it? Amazon. All right, here we go. All right, so let me just share the screen so that everybody could see it. And then we're going to move. If you look at the top, it's pinned, is the link to go to the after show so you guys could jump on. So this is Dr. Joshua Aaron Bowen. He has the Atheist volume of the Old Testament, volume 1. And then you also have volume 2. All right. So you have volume 2. You have different formats. You got the Kindle, the Audible version, the hardcover, the paperback. These are the details. Learn how to read ancient Sumerian. All right. Did the Old Testament endorse slavery? Learn to pray in a dead language, education, and invocation in ancient Sumerian. All right. So that's where you could purchase the books. All right. For those who want to partake in the after show, jump on the other side, and the link is at the top. You could jump over there now. I'm going to start that show now. So you guys could go over there. It's also on Facebook. It's also on the Dagger Squad YouTube, which is Brother Garfi University. So you guys could jump over there and jump on and catch it on the other side. All right. So move over to that side. I'm going to put the link in the chat again for those who want to be a part of the after show. Hold on one second. It's actually the after show already started. Let me get this link right here for you guys so you guys could jump on. Here's the link again for the YouTube. Jump on right away so we could, whoever have questions or comments regarding the actual interview, you could jump on and ask all the questions that you want. But moving forward, that was an excellent interview. One of the best interviews I've actually ever done. I actually enjoy doing that interview. All right. Peace and love to all those who are listening. Jump over to the other side. Peace.